China, meantime, as we've been saying, has been promising to fight a trade war to the end. It's responding to a 1-2 punch from the United States. Now, the tariffs on steel and aluminum announced earlier this month, and tariffs on about $50 billion worth of goods announced on Thursday. Now, China has responded with tough rhetoric, of course, but we have to say the action has actually been restrained. The government plans to slap tariffs on about $3 billion worth of U.S. goods, ranging from steel pipes to pork. Now, China has also threatened to slow its purchases of U.S. government bonds. That was what Claire was talking about, which was a huge risk to the market. China is America's biggest creditor. Who could forget? It holds about $1 trillion of U.S. debt. Now, President Trump insists relations with China are, of course, good. Actually, he says they're great, and markets won't be affected.
Well, I think the stock market's going to be great. I mean, look, the stock market's way up. When I came into office, the stock market was from a different planet. It's way up. China is going to end up treating us fairly. For many years, they had free rein. They don't have free rein anymore. We're very friendly with China. We have great relationships with China. And look, it's time. It's time. Last year, we lost $500 billion on trade with China. We can't let that happen. Thank you all very much.
Joining me now, Ann Lee is an adjunct professor at New York University and the author of What the U.S. Can Learn from China. What the U.S. is learning from China now is exactly how it will react. You know, many people have interpreted the reaction as being restrained. Is it truly restrained, meaning how long can it last, and what would change that equation for China?
Well, it looks like China really is exercising judo strategy, which is let the opponent just throw all their weight and force and let it backfire on them. So I think China is trying to restrain itself and look like the good guy in the international field, which is what they did when Trump pulled out of the Paris Accords and said, oh, we're not going to restrain ourselves with carbon emissions. And China stepped up to the plate and said, oh, we'll still take the lead there. And it looks like here China wants to also do the same thing by saying, look, we're trying to be international law-abiding a country and want to follow the international rules while the U.S. violates, and hopefully people will follow.
But will they take that only for so long? Meaning, obviously, China has a lot to lose if there's any kind of a trade war at stake. At what point can we really see this, get a lot uglier than it is now?
Well, I guess it really depends on what the U.S. does, too, right? Because the U.S. says they're going to obviously do more than what's already been announced.
And yet they said this is a negotiation. They've been very plain about that.
I hardly think that they're really sincere about it, but they can say whatever they want and may not follow through. Look, China really wants to avoid it because they know that history shows trade wars can lead to real wars. And a real war between U.S. and China is the last thing anybody wants on earth, right? So I think they're trying to do whatever they can to try to tamp down the rhetoric, the actions, and slow it down so that hopefully cooler heads can prevail. But obviously, China's not going to just sit there and let the U.S. walk all over it. They're going to draw the line somewhere. And we know that China has drawn very strict lines around national security issues regarding boundaries like Taiwan. And so if the Trump administration decides to go after those geopolitical areas, certainly China is not going to stand by.
And when we look at the entire picture of trade having to do, again, in Asia, when we look to South Korea, okay, they've been trying to renegotiate course. So Wilbur Ross was at the White House today, Commerce Secretary, saying, look, we could have this signed in a week. Now, I was in Seoul not too long ago, had a briefing from U.S. officials about this. What was so interesting is the pains that they went to make sure they could separate the security situation from real agitation on trade. At what point did this become an imperative, meaning we have to take trade off the table because security is just too important to us?
You mean the U.S.?
Yes, the U.S. actually capitulating and said, let's get this done. Let's get this course signed, meaning the trade agreement with South Korea.
Well, we'll see. I mean, the U.S. certainly wants South Korea on its side for any geopolitical issues that flare up, and they sorely need them as an ally. And so So in that sense, South Korea may have the upper hand if that's truly the case. And what it does look like is that they're gunning for, a real conflict, meaning a hot war of some sort. And so if that's the case, then the Trump administration is going to try to hand-wring any of its allies to basically say, you've got to be on our side, and they're going to use whatever tactics they'll need to do.
It was nonetheless a really interesting development because South Korea has been a real irritant on trade for several years with the United States. Thanks so much for coming in. Really appreciate it on what has been an incredibly busy day. We now know that China, as we were talking about, will retaliate. The question, though, is specifically how. Now, the next potential weapon, the tiny little soybean. Matt Rivers has more.
It is the largest deficit of any country in the history of our world. It's out of control.
With that, Donald Trump took his first major action specifically against China on trade. The president authorized some $60 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese imports to the U.S. after a 7-month investigation into alleged Chinese theft of American intellectual property. Though we don't exactly know which of its products will be hit with a new tax, China has already vowed to not take the hit lying down. Case in point, Beijing just responded to U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum products that Trump announced earlier this month by threatening to levy new taxes on American imports here worth $3 billion on everything from fruits and nuts to steel pipes. All this talk of tit for tat is making American industries nervous. Start with the simple soybean. The U.S. is the world's top soybean exporter, and China is its biggest buyer by far. Billions and billions of dollars worth was unloaded at ports like this one last year. And American farmers are well positioned to take advantage of that growth. The U.S. Soybean Export Council expects U.S. exports of soybeans to keep rising for at least the next 20 years. And it's not just farmers reaping the benefits.
Your diner and your doctors and your and other companies.
But already, officials and Chinese state media have singled out soybeans as a potential top target in Beijing's retaliation against these U.S. tariffs.
They know that if you look at President Trump's election and where those votes came from, a lot of them came from the Midwest in states that are very large in soybean production.
Kirk Leeds is visiting China with an agricultural delegation from one such U.S. state, Iowa.
The rhetoric, as you begin to perhaps pick winners and losers in trade relations and negotiations, that American farmers will, unfortunately, might be the ones that will pay the price for other industries.
Restrictions on market access could devastate U.S. industry, and it's not just soy. Other industries and companies could be government targets too. Think Apple or Boeing or Cisco, pawns in a potential trade war with lots of influence back home. A recent survey shows the majority of U.S. companies in China think trade between both countries isn't fair. They want things to change, but nobody wants a trade war. To achieve both, any new U.S. policies will have to walk a fine line, as thin as a flake of soybean. Matt Rivers, CNN, Qinhuangdao, China.
Okay, a roll.